Bhakti Vedanta Swamini Tinamini Namaste Saraswati Devi Guruvani Pracharine Nirvisesa Sunyavadi Paskatya Desatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Dvaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Dvaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay? Good. Haribol. Okay, so I'm checking to see if I received homework. Yeah, I got from Agastya and Samart. And I think Krishna Raheja also. Let's see what Krishna wrote. What happens at the time of death? What is kutam? Okay, so he did previous homework, but let's read this. The two different paths at the time of death are to 1, repeat going back to the material world, or 2, go back to Krishna. The teachings of Lord Chaitanya, chapter 12, explains that one who takes full shelter of the Supreme Lord at the time of death can attain immortality at that time and becomes eligible to be with the Supreme Lord in transcendental bliss. In Bhagavad Gita 8.26, it is explained how there is a path of light, Krishna consciousness, in where one never returns to the dark material world. And there is the path of darkness, material world, where one never returns to the light, Krishna consciousness. If one goes back to the material world, their birth and life is decided by their good and bad karma, good karma and bad karma, and akarma. If one has good karma, meaning they did pious activities in their previous life, they will enjoy reactions of the good karma. If one has bad karma, they will suffer. But if one has akarma, they will not get any results, good or bad. Akarma is action with no reaction. Depending on their karma, their next life will be shaped. At the time of death, you will go back to Krishna or stay in the material world in another body. Another question. In Bhagavad Gita 8.26, Srila Prabhupada explained how the fruitive laborers and philosophical speculators are constantly going and coming. Does this mean that they are stuck in the material cycle? What does it mean in Bhagavad Gita 8.27 when Srila Prabhupada wrote, A devotee of the Supreme Lord should not worry whether he will depart by arrangement or by accident. Now, are those questions for me, or are those questions you're going to answer, Krishna? Let's see. Next he writes, explain what a kutam is, and in parentheses, tendency to be attracted to sinning, how it awakens, what it forces us to do. Kutam means a person is almost ready to produce the seed of sinful desire or effect of the sinful desire. There are dormant seeds full of sinful desires stored inside of us that sprout after association with material nature. Okay, so it's a tendency to sin that may go from one life to the next. Even after having sinned and suffered for it, one may still retain the tendency or attraction to sin that could go from one life to the next. Okay. So I guess when Krishna writes questions, in Bhagavad Gita 8.26, Srila Prabhupada explained how the fruitive laborers and philosophical speculators are constantly going and coming. Does this mean that they're stuck in the material cycle? Answer is yes. What does it mean in Bhagavad Gita 8.27 when Srila Prabhupada wrote, a devotee of the Supreme Lord should not worry whether he will depart by arrangement or by accident? Well, if you look in that purport, you'll see that Prabhupada says, even if you cannot remember all the good things you did, or if you cannot remember at the moment of life, Krishna never forgets. That's the point. So Krishna never forgets what you have done for him. And therefore it says, what does it mean in 8.27 when Srila Prabhupada wrote, a devotee of the Supreme Lord should not worry whether he will depart by arrangement or by accident? Yes, so the devotee who's engaged in devotional service should have full faith that Krishna never forgets his devotional service, and that even if he can't remember due to whatever circumstances there may be at the moment of death, Krishna himself will not forget, and he will be saved from the cycle of birth and death. Okay, good. So thank you, Krishna. All right, so let's see who else. We also got homework from Samart. Okay. Explain what is Namabhasa using Chaitanya Charitamrita Antya Lila chapter 3. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita Antya Lila chapter 3, Srila Prabhupada describes Namabhasa. In the synonyms section of CC Antya 3.53, he translates Namabhasa to almost chanting the holy name of the Lord without offenses. Okay. In Chaitanya Charitamrita Antya Lila chapter 3, verse 55, Namacharya Haridas Thakura, the authority on the chanting of the holy name, said, the chanting of the Lord's holy name to indicate something other than the Lord is an instance of Namabhasa. Even when the holy name is chanted in this way, its transcendental power is not destroyed. This means that even if we do not chant the holy names of the Lord properly, the transcendental power is still there. In the Srimad Bhagvatam 5, Canto 5, chapter 24, verse number 20, Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, the Namabhasa stage is between that of Namaparad, or chanting the holy name with offenses, and pure chanting. There are 3 stages in chanting the holy name of the Lord. In the first stage, one commits 10 kinds of offenses while chanting. In the next stage, Namabhasa, the offenses have almost stopped, and one is coming to the platform of pure chanting. Okay, very good, Samart. Very good homework. You got it exactly right. And now we also got homework from Agastya Prabhu. All right, let's see what Agastya wrote. What is Namabhasa? I wasn't able to find many verses for this. Okay, wait a second. One second. I only found one in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Antya Leela, 3rd chapter, 55th verse. Shri Harivilas Thakur says, the chanting of the Lord's holy name to indicate something other than the Lord is an instance of Namabhasa. Well, that's exactly what Ajamil did. He chanted the name Narayana, but he meant his son Narayana and not the Lord. But still, because it was the name of the Lord, it acted, and he did it at the moment of death. Therefore, he chanted without material desires, and therefore he said it in a sense in a pure way, because he was not trying to nullify his sinful desires. He was just saying the name Narayana, and therefore all his sinful reactions for many births, not only his present birth but his previous births, were all eradicated because saying the holy name once purely, not even meaning Lord Narayana. He just said the name. So therefore, the chanting of the Lord's holy name to indicate something other than the Lord is an instance of Namabhasa. Even when the holy name is chanted in this way, its transcendental power is not destroyed. After analyzing the statement, you can deduce that the definition of Namabhasa is chanting the holy name for something other than remembering the Lord. An example of this is when Ajamila called out the name of Narayana. He wasn't actually calling for the Lord, but rather for his son, which made it Namabhasa. Okay, well, very good, Agastya. Very good research and answering the question. Okay, so now we'll go forward in chapter 6, in Canto 6, chapter 2. I'm sorry, chapter 2, verse number 1, right. Canto 6, chapter 2, verse number 1. And this verse says, Sukadeva Goswami said, my dear king, the servants of Lord Vishnu are always very expert in logic and arguments. After hearing the statements of the Yamadutas, they replied as follows. So here Sukadeva Goswami is explaining to Maharaj Parikshit the exchange that took place between the agents of Yamaraj, called the Yamadutas, and the agents of Lord Vishnu, called the Vishnudutas. And at the moment of Ajamil's death, both the Yamadutas and the Vishnudutas came, and the Vishnudutas stopped the Yamadutas from taking the soul of Yamaraj, the soul of Ajamil, to be judged for his sinful activities. And they were going to take him to Yamaraj, the demigod in charge of death and retribution for sinful activities. And Ajamil, of course, had committed many, many sins, innumerable number of sins during his life. Although he was born the son of a Brahmana, he had witnessed some low-class people, a man and a woman, engaged in inappropriate behavior, and it had influenced him to give up all the good qualities he had learned as a young boy and as a son of a Brahmana family. He gave it all up, and the rest of his life he engaged in sinful activities. So he had committed many sins, but he said the name of Narayana at the moment of death, calling his son, not even meaning Lord Narayana, but because he said it without any purpose of, like, for example, nullifying his sins. The holy name of the Lord can nullify all sins of a person, but he just said it, and that's when you say the name of the Lord without referring to the Lord specifically, that's called namabhasa, technically in Sanskrit. And even though one says the name of the Lord and not meaning the Lord, still the name acted, still the name purified all his sinful reactions from this life and all his previous lives. And so, therefore, now they're going to, and now Sukadeva Goswami is going to continue explaining to Maharaj Parikshit what happened. The Vishnu Dutas said, this is text number 2, the agents of Lord Vishnu, alas, how painful it is that irreligion is being introduced into an assembly where religion should be maintained. Indeed, those in charge of maintaining the religious principles are needlessly punishing a sinless, unpunishable person. So this is the real issue, that the Yamadutas are wanting to take Ajamil and present him to Yamaraj to be judged for all his sins, but the Vishnu Dutas are forbidding them, saying, although he has sinned so much in his life, because he said the name of Narayana at the moment of death, all his sins are purged. And this is incomprehensible to the Yamadutas. They've never heard anything like this before, that simply saying the name of God once at the moment of death can expunge all sinful activities that one's committed in this life and previous lives. So they just can't understand it. The Vishnu Dutas accused the Yamadutas of violating the religious principles by attempting to drag Ajamil to Yamaraja for punishment. Yamaraja is the officer appointed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead to judge religious and irreligious principles and to punish people who are irreligious. However, if completely sinful people are punished, the entire assembly of Yamaraj is contaminated. This principle applies not only in the assembly of Yamaraj, but throughout human society also. In human society, properly maintaining religious principles is the duty of the king's court or the government. Unfortunately, in this yuga, this present time, Kali Yuga, the age of hypocrisy and quarrel, the religious principles are tampered with, and the government cannot properly judge who is to be punished and who is not. It is said that in the Kali Yuga, if one cannot spend money in court, or if one does not have enough money, basically, to get a good lawyer in court, one cannot get justice. Indeed, in courts of justice, it is often found that magistrates are bribed for favorable judgments. Sometimes religious men who preach the Krishna consciousness movement for the benefit of the entire populace are arrested and harassed by the police and courts. The Vishnu Dutas, who are Vaishnavas, lamented for these very regrettable facts. Because of their spiritual compassion for all the fallen souls, Vaishnavas go out to preach according to the standard method of all religious principles, but unfortunately, because of the influence of Kali Yuga, Vaishnavas who have dedicated their lives to preaching the glories of the Lord are sometimes harassed and punished by courts on false charges of disturbing the peace. Well, these are some points that are applicable to modern life. That is, accusing a person of a crime that they did not commit, or accusing people who are engaged in spreading the glories of Lord Krishna as doing the wrong things, Well, actually, they're doing the prime duty of life, and that is to spread knowledge of Krishna consciousness. So it takes time to understand this, because in Kali Yuga, everything is backwards. Right is considered wrong, and wrong is considered right. Just like in the case of abortion. Abortion used to be illegal, but now, since Roe versus Wade has become legal, so this is something that's extremely sinful, but yet today people can engage in that sinful activity and speculate that it's actually the right thing to do based on their own selfish desire for not accepting the responsibility to bring a child into the world, even though they engaged in the act of procreation. So this is one example of something that's wrong that's considered right in this age. And there are many other things, such as previously, I remember when I first joined the Hare Krishna movement, when we would go out and do Sankirtan in the streets of Paris, we were arrested by the police for disturbing the peace. Of course, we didn't purposely try and harass people. We were always very careful of chanting and not disturbing the peace in the sense of blocking the sidewalks or chanting in such a way that people would be disturbed. But still, we would be arrested because they didn't know who we were, and they thought maybe we were crazy. But after being arrested, I was arrested multiple times, many times, and kept sometimes in jail overnight. But eventually they realized that we were harmless, and we were genuinely chanting the names of God without causing any real disturbance. In fact, most people liked it. They would dance with us, they would chant with us. Nobody really objected, because we never stayed in one place for very long. So eventually the police stopped arresting us. But it took some time. So now, verse number 3, it says, a king or governmental official should be so well qualified that he acts as a father, maintainer, and protector of the citizens because of affection and love. He should give the citizens good advice and instructions according to the standard scriptures, and should be equal to everyone. Yamaraj does this, for he is the supreme master of justice, and so do those who follow in his footsteps. However, if such persons become polluted and exhibit partiality by punishing an innocent, blameless person, where will the citizens go to take shelter for their maintenance and security? Well, this is a very important point. If the guardians of the peace are themselves corrupt, then it's a hopeless situation for the good people in the age of Kali. So, therefore, if someone is going to be a government or official, whether they're a tax collector or they're a police person or they're a security person, whatever, if they're not qualified to act as a well-wisher, like a father or a maintainer or a protector of the citizens, with respect for the citizens, then and give the citizens good advice and instructions according to the standard scriptures, and I guess also the laws of the state, by which they should be equal to everyone. So then it's going to create a lot of confusion and frustration for good people in the society, and the bad people will be favored instead of the good people. So, in the purport to this verse, Srila Prabhupada writes, the king, or in modern times, the government, should act as the guardian of the citizens by teaching them the proper goal of life. The human form of life is especially meant for realization of one's self and one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because this cannot be realized in animal life. In other words, the purpose of human life is self-realization. It's not to live like an animal, simply eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. Animals do that, and if humans do that also, they're not different than the animal. What differentiates a human being from an animal is that the human being can understand his or her relationship with God and act appropriately in the service of God or Krishna to please the Lord and to develop respect and kindness towards all other living entities, including animals, not only human beings. So the human form of life is especially meant for realization of oneself and one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because this cannot be realized in animal life. The duty of the government, therefore, is to take charge of training all the citizens in such a way that by gradual process they will be elevated to the spiritual platform and will realize the self and the self's relationship with God. This principle was followed by kings like Maharaj Yudhishthira, Maharaj Parikshit, Lord Ramachandra, Maharaj Ambarisha, and Prahlad Maharaj in ancient times. The leaders of the government must be very honest and religious, because otherwise all the affairs of the state will suffer. Unfortunately, in the name of democracy, rogues and thieves are electing other rogues and thieves to the most important posts in the government. Recently, this has been proven in America when the president, we're talking about President Nixon now, had to be condemned and dragged down from his post by the citizens. This is only one case, but there are many others. Because of the importance of the Krishna consciousness movement, people should be Krishna conscious. Okay, we have to keep quiet, please. In the temple room, we can't have conversations in the temple room. You have to keep quiet, please. If you have to talk, you can go outside there and talk, no problem. Temple room, you have to be quiet. Unfortunately, in the name of democracy, rogues and thieves are electing other rogues and thieves to the most important posts in the government. Recently, this has been proven in America, where the president had to be condemned and dragged down from his post by the citizens. This is only one case, but there are many others. Because of the importance of the Krishna consciousness movement, people should be Krishna conscious and should not vote for anyone who is not Krishna conscious. Then there will be actual peace and prosperity in the state. When a Vaishnava sees mismanagement in the government, he feels great compassion in his heart and tries his best to purify the situation by spreading the Hare Krishna movement. Well, we've seen this all over the world. In Germany, they voted Hitler to become the leader of the country, and in 12 short years he completely ruined Germany. In India, sometimes they vote for a person who's murdered someone or is known to be cheating the government and cheating the people, but still they vote for him, and he becomes a minister in the government. In the United States, Nixon was, he seemed to be doing some good things, but he also engaged in illegal activity, and he had to be taken out. And recently, President Trump, although he did some good things also, but he was legally voted out, whereas Nixon was forced out of his position. So the problem with democracy is that unqualified people vote for other unqualified people to become leaders, and it just disrupts society. Whereas in previous times, there was saintly monarchy, where a young man would be trained from childhood to become king or a Kshatriya. Kshatriyas also are leaders of society. They might not be the king, but they protect the citizenry. So that training was spiritual as well as material training, not just material training. So when you have someone like Maharaj Parikshit or Yudhisthira Maharaj or Dhruva Maharaj or Prahlad Maharaj, they were Rajarsis, saintly kings. And then, of course, Lord Ramachandra, he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but he was acting as a saintly king. And therefore, people respected Lord Ramachandra and respected other great persons like Prahlad Maharaj, and naturally lived, were trained by the example of the king and the king's ministers, who were all devotees, to live piously and ethically and follow the principles of Sanatana Dharma as well as the laws of the state. So we are always in human life faced with two sets of laws. One are the laws of the state, and the other are the laws given by God, or Sanatana Dharma. Dharma means your prescribed occupational duty, and Sanatana means not your temporary duty, but your eternal duty. So one has a temporary duty. You have to follow the rules of society, such as you have to follow the speed limits, and you have to pay taxes, and you have to do so many different things to satisfy the state. But there's another set of laws called Sanatana Dharma or Varnashrama Dharma, where you have to follow rules set by God himself, such as no meat eating, no gambling, no intoxication, no illicit sex, regularly chanting the names of God, regularly hearing the holy scriptures like Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagvatam, and regularly eating only sanctified food, prasadam, and regularly coming to the temple and performing seva or service. So these are so there are two sets of laws that we have to follow. Usually people ignore the spiritual laws, and therefore they get, even though they might follow the material laws, they violate the laws of karma, and then they have to suffer, even though they think that they are good people, but actually by voluntarily or unwittingly not following the rules of Sanatana Dharma, they become sinners, such as eating meat, gambling, illicit sex, intoxication, lying, cheating, and engaging in criminal activity and so forth. Well, criminal activity is not only killing people, but killing animals also. So most people think they shouldn't kill people, but it's all right to kill animals and eat them. So therefore, out of ignorance, they're committing sinful activities, and they're becoming they're getting negative reactions or pop. They're engaging in sins, and they're getting karma for that. And because they're not educated properly, they're doing it unwittingly. So therefore, we can say that sometimes bad things happen to so-called good people. Well, they're not actually good, but they don't remember breaking any of the rules of society. Well, that's because the society has become corrupted. They think it's all right to kill cows and eat them. They think it's all right to have abortion because the society permits it. They think it's all right to not follow the rules of Sanatana Dharma. So therefore they suffer unnecessarily due to ignorance. Okay, so then verse number 4, the mass of people follow the example of a leader in society and imitate his behavior. They accept as evidence whatever the leader accepts. So this is actually a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, or it's similar to a verse from Bhagavad Gita. Yad yada chariti shreshtas tatat evitaro kuru. Sapramanam kuruse lokastad anuvartate. So this means, this says that whatever a great man does, common men follow, and whatever standards he establishes become the standards of society. Well, if the so-called great man is a rogue, and a non-devotee and a nonsense, then people will follow what he does. Like, for example, I had years ago when my sister-in-law, the lady that my brother married, was still living. She was a chain smoker. So one day I asked her, I said, how come you smoke so much? Or how come you smoke at all? And she said, oh, well, when I was a young girl, I went to the movies in the 1940s, and I saw Humphrey Bogart, who was a big movie star, in this one movie where he was smoking cigarettes. And I thought it was so cool, I started smoking also. Well, fast forward now to the 1960s and 1970s, she had emphysema. Emphysema means your lungs are not functioning properly, and therefore you have to carry an oxygen tank with you wherever you go every day, and even at home, so that you don't die of suffocation, so you can breathe. And she had this oxygen tank with her all the time. And you'll see this, sometimes people are walking around with these plastic tubes that seem to go from their ear to their nostrils. Well, those plastic tubes are connected to an oxygen tank. Now, previously, the oxygen tank was very big, and they need like a little cart that would pull along as they walked along the street or went to the store or wherever they went. Nowadays, the oxygen tank is a lot smaller, but the idea is that without that oxygen, they'll die because they've ruined their lungs by smoking. See? And why did my sister-in-law smoke? Because she saw a movie star, Humphrey Bogart, smoking on the big screen when she was a young girl, and she thought it was cool. So when great people engage in sinful activity, then an unwitting society, young girls, young boys, see their low-class behavior, and they think it's right. Now, this is also happening in India. India, before Bollywood, used to make nice movies in the 1950s and 60s, How a Mother Loves Her Son or How a Son Loves His Mother. And those movies were shown all over the world. In fact, those movies used to be shown in the Soviet Union, in communist Russia, and also in the Muslim world. I went to Morocco in 1971, and people were watching Bollywood movies because the themes in those movies were very good. Even in Muslim countries where they don't at all have any respect for Hinduism, but yet they would watch these movies made in Bollywood. Well, fast forward now today, Bollywood is not different than Hollywood. They're both nonsense. The kind of movies they make and the themes they have now are not different than each other. It's all about violence and illicit sex and all kinds of crazy things people are doing. And people get corrupted by watching it. In fact, this has been very, very instrumental in corrupting people even in the villages of India, where before Sanatan Dharma was sort of protected in those villages, and now because of television. And the whole thing was done very, very, let's say, cleverly orchestrated. When television became very popular in India, they were showing the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And all of a sudden, because of these great epic stories, all of India would stop to watch the next episode of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. And then therefore, people bought televisions. Even in poor villages, they would have at least one television, and everyone would come together to watch the next series of the Mahabharata. In the big cities, the taxi drivers would stop to see the next series of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. It was a very clever strategy. And then people got used to watching the television, and then little by little, the Mahabharata became gangster movies and sexual scenes in the movies and all kinds of things. And it's corrupted India. Nowadays, many times you go to somebody's house in India, and they have a big screen television, and it's on all day long. And even if you visit the house, they're watching the television as you try and talk to them and say, "How are you?" So I've seen this. Even in the United States, that big screen television is on all the time, and people, their whole life is around sitting watching television rather than seeing and watching Ramayana or Mahabharata or spending quality time with their family. So these are some of the modern techniques of changing the culture of the common people from the culture of Sanatana Dharma to the culture of Adharma. So the mass of people follow the example of a leader in society and imitate his behavior. They accept as evidence whatever the leader accepts. And then Srila Prabhupada writes in the explanation to this verse, although Ajamila was not punishable, the Yamadutas were insisting on taking him away to Yamaraj for punishment. This was adharma, contrary to religious principles. The Vishnudutas feared that if such irreligious acts were allowed, the management of human society would be spoiled. In modern times, the Krishna consciousness movement is trying to introduce the right principles of management for human society. But unfortunately, the governments of Kali Yuga do not properly support the Hare Krishna movement because they do not appreciate its valuable service. The Hare Krishna movement is the right movement for ameliorating or improving the fallen condition of human society, and therefore governments and public leaders in every part of the world should support this movement to completely rectify humanity's sinful condition. Well, this is why people suffer, because they commit sins. But today, because of so many false philosophers, so many false prophets, so many false gurus, so many false politicians, so many false teachers in the schools, they're teaching adharma to be dharma and dharma to be adharma. So therefore, one example of that is in the 1950s, there were different psychologists writing books that became very famous. Like there was one book which said, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Now, what does this mean? Well, up until that time, it was thought that punishing children for wrongdoing was the right thing to do. But then these psychologists started writing books like the one I just mentioned, written by Dr. Spock, a psychologist, who said, spare the rod and spoil the child. That means don't use a punishment stick on your child, and rather reward the child for doing wrong things. So what happened was, that was in the 1940s and 50s. So what happened was when people started having children in the 1950s, by the time they grew up in the 1960s, they became hippies. They were smoking marijuana. You had the sexual revolution in America. They were rioting in the streets, and they were not working. They were dropping out of school and becoming hippies. And then suddenly people realized, wait a minute, what did we do? We believed these crazy psychologists to not punish our kids when they do wrong things and to ignore teaching them to do the right things. So therefore, there was almost a complete breakdown of the society in the 1960s. And but that general idea of not training children properly became institutionalized in America in the educational system. So today, I remember when this happened, in the 1960s, I was in junior high school and high school, and I graduated in 1968. One day when I was I just entered ninth grade. One day, one of my teachers, who every morning when we would come to class, he would read the Bible. In fact, that was normal in all the schools, public schools in America. One day we came in, and he was really upset, and he didn't read the Bible. That was the day that the federal government forbade reading the Bible in schools, public schools. And all the students in my class, there were a few of us who were Christians. Most of them were Jewish, and they were so happy. And the teacher was really upset, but he was holding back his anger that the federal government had forbidden the reading of Bible, and from that day on, they no longer read the Bible, or he no longer read the Bible in class. So this was another sign of the changing culture in America, and it's continuing today. Little by little, all the rules of Dharma are being violated legally by government appointees, congressmen, and senators and things like that on the state level, on the federal level, passing more and more laws forbidding the following of dharmic principles and making sinful activities legal. So, therefore, you have legal marijuana now, as well as liquor, and you have legal psychotropic drugs like Xanax and benzodiazepines. You have almost 50% of the population in the United States taking these type of drugs to calm their minds and have a feeling of euphoria. And it's ruining people, ruining their ability to follow principles of decency and cleanliness and mercy and truthfulness. All these things are being destroyed by the educational system and by the institutionalization of sinful things and making them legal. Okay, so this was happening way back in the time of Ajamila. This is thousands of years ago. So this tendency of the deterioration of the fiber of human goodness is not something new. It's always been present. It's simply amplified in Kali Yuga, the age in which we're living now, this age of hypocrisy and quarrel. Okay, so now we'll go forward. The Hare Krishna movement is the right movement for ameliorating the fallen condition of human society, and therefore governments and public leaders in every part of the world should support this movement to completely rectify humanity's sinful condition. Okay, now text. This is Canto 6, Chapter 2, now text 5 and 6. The people in general are not very advanced in knowledge by which to discriminate between religion and irreligion. The innocent, unenlightened citizen is like an ignorant animal sleeping in peace with its head on the lap of its master, faithfully believing in the master's protection. If a leader is actually kind-hearted and deserves to be the object of a living entity's faith, how can he punish or kill a foolish person who has fully surrendered in good faith and friendship? So this is what you call a rhetorical question in English. A rhetorical question is one where the answer is perfectly evident and everyone knows what the answer should be. So let's hear what the explanation of this verse is. The Sanskrit word Vishvasta Gata refers to one who breaks faith or causes a breach of trust. The mass of people should always feel security because of the government's protection. Therefore, how regrettable it is for the government itself to cause a breach of trust and put the citizens in difficulty for political reasons. We actually saw during the partition days in India that although Hindus and Muslims were living together peacefully, manipulation by politicians suddenly aroused feelings of hatred between them, and thus the Hindus and Muslims killed one another over politics. This is a sign of Kali Yuga. In this age, animals are kept nicely sheltered, completely confident that their masters will protect them. But unfortunately, as soon as the animals are fat, they are immediately sent for slaughter. Such cruelty is condemned by Vaishnavas like the Vishnudutas. Indeed, the hellish conditions already described await the sinful men responsible for such suffering. One who betrays the confidence of a living entity, who takes shelter of him in good faith, whether that living entity be a human being or an animal, is extremely sinful. Because such betrayals are now going unpunished by the government, all the human society is terribly contaminated. The people of this age are therefore described as manda sumanda matayo, manda bhagya hi upadruta. As a consequence of such sinfulness, men are condemned, manda. Their intelligence is unclear, sumanda mataya. They are unfortunate, manda bhagya, and therefore they are always disturbed by many problems, upadruta. This is their situation in this life, and after death they're punished in hellish conditions. Well, this is why traditionally in India, when a person dies, 11 days or 15 days or 12 or 13 days after the death, you have the Shraddha ceremony. Of course, now people are not doing the Shraddha ceremony. The older generations have not been able to teach their kids the importance of these things. The Shraddha ceremony is very extremely important to be performed by the elder sons, or at least elder members of the family, after the death of a loved one. Because if the person died and was not actually thinking of God at the moment of death, but thinking of their 401k or who's going to inherit my dog or some crazy thing like that, then they will take birth in a lower form of life, like a dog or a cat or a rat or a snake. And that is extremely stressful, an extremely horrible thing to happen. So the Shraddha ceremony is a way of communicating with the loved one who's passed away. And by performing the ceremony, one can offer their punya, or their pious activities, to the person that has died, so that that person doesn't have to take birth in such a horrible lower species, and can at least have a human birth and have the possibility of solving the problem of birth, death, old age, and disease. If they didn't do it in this life, they'll get another chance in the next life. Otherwise, if that ceremony is not performed, then the person, if they have been more sinful than pious, due to their karma, they'll take birth in a lower form of life. And there are 8,400,000 different species. There are aquatics, and there are insects, and there are birds and reptiles, and there are plants, and there are mammals, and there are human beings, going from the wild or uncivilized human beings all the way up to the demigods. So there are 8,400,000 species that we can take birth in. To get to the human form, we've gone through most of those species in previous lives. So once you get to the human form, if you don't use all the assets we have as human beings, and there are many great assets that we have that are specific for self-realization. For example, we have highly developed senses: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, and the mind. And then above the mind is the intelligence. And if we don't use these great assets for self-realization, but we only use them for advancing in sense gratification, then we'll definitely take birth as some kind of animal or lower species in the next life, because we have abused the human form of life. Instead of striving for sense gratification, we strive to make money. Instead of striving for self-realization, we think that the goal of life is to make a lot of money and use it for sense gratification. And therefore, that is what animals do. They engage in sense gratification 24 hours a day. So therefore, we don't deserve to be a human being in the next life. So here it says, the mass of people should always feel security because of the government's protection. Therefore, how regrettable it is for the government itself to cause a breach of trust and put the citizens in difficulty for political reasons. Like, for example, when your child is born, they're usually submissive and they listen to the advice of the parents. But as they grow older, going to public and private schools, they are influenced by the changing culture in the United States and in India. And at one point, they can become, they can revolt against the authority of their parents. This is what happened in a big way in the 1960s when kids started becoming hippies. But this is happening all the time now, where at a certain point, the parents bring the children to the temple and they say, Jai Karo, Jai Karo. And so the child bows down or pays respects to the deity. But later on, after they've been fully indoctrinated with material education in middle school, high school, kindergarten, and so forth, if you say Jai Karo, they don't go down anymore. They don't pay their respects. They say, why should I do this? I don't even understand why I should do it. Why should I bow down in front of the deities? Why should I even go to the temple? I want to go to have a good time ice skating, or I want to go smoke marijuana. Why should I come to the temple? So all of a sudden, there's a change of culture that took place, and the parents didn't realize what was happening. They were sending their kids to these schools where the children are indoctrinated with atheistic principles, such as everything starts with a big bang. There's no God. And there's Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. This is the way there are different species in life. So kids are indoctrinated to become atheistic. And even though the parents themselves are not atheistic, at a certain time, kids no longer believe in God because they've been indoctrinated, and the parents send their kids to these schools. So this is the sorry fate of modern society. So therefore, it says, one example is the Hindu-Muslim riots that took place after after India had partition. Before, the Muslims were ruling the Hindus for about 800 years in India, and but yet, of course, they violently attacked India, like Muhammad Ghori and others. India was attacked by Iranian Muslims, and then attacked by Afghani Muslims, attacked by Mughals, and they were attacked by Arabs, So before that, they were attacked by the Greeks. So they were able to, well, at that time, there were no Muslims in India. The Muslims, when they started attacking, they came, but through different policies, they were able to force or convince many people to leave Hinduism and become Muslims. One way was with the jizya tax. The jizya tax was practiced by Muslims whenever they ruled a country, whether it was a Christian country or a Hindu country or a Parsi country like Iran. They forced people to pay a tax if they were not Muslims. And the poor people who were not able to pay the tax, they were forced to become Muslims or put into jail or killed. And the people who had money were able to pay the tax and not be forcibly converted. So this is why, and then also the Hindu priests and Brahmins became very fanatical, and they made rules also that if a Hindu worked for a Muslim, or if Muslims threw water from their hand wash on a Hindu, that person could no longer be a Hindu. So because of the craziness of the Brahmins and the fanaticism of the Muslims, many Hindus were converted to Islam. Like, for example, Jinnah, who was a prominent Indian politician and a Muslim, his grandfather, and from the time of his grandfather, they converted to Islam. And then Jinnah was like a second-generation Muslim, whereas for many generations, his family were Hindus. And over time, the British, when they saw that eventually they were going to lose India as its prize colonial country, they fomented hatred between Muslims and Hindus. That's a long story. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. It was done in a very clever way. And therefore, at the partition, there was a complete breakdown. And right before partition and after partition, there were massacres of Hindus by Muslims, and vice versa, somewhat. But there were many more Hindus died than Muslims. So this is an example where the government people don't actually protect the people, but they themselves are low class, just like Jinnah, and also the Hindu leaders like Nehru and so forth. And what happens is that the people are helpless, and they become party to massacres, and then they're forced to leave their ancestral homes and move to another country and so forth. Okay, so this is a sign of Kali Yuga. In this age, animals are kept nicely sheltered, completely confident that their masters will protect them. But unfortunately, as soon as the animals are fat, they are immediately sent for slaughter. Such cruelty is condemned by Vaishnavas like the Vishnu Dutas. Indeed, the hellish conditions already described await the sinful man responsible for such suffering. One who betrays the confidence of a living entity, who takes shelter of him in good faith, whether that living entity be a human being or an animal, is extremely sinful. Because such betrayals now go unpunished by the government, all of human society is terribly contaminated. The people of this age are therefore described as Manda Sumanda Matayo, Manda Bhagya, Hyubhadrata. As a consequence of such sinfulness, men are condemned, Manda, their intelligence is unclear, Sumanda Mataya. They are unfortunate, Manda Bhagya, and therefore they are always disturbed by many problems, Upadruta. This is their situation in this life, and after death they are punished in hellish conditions. Haribol. So we read the first 6 verses of Canto 6, Chapter 2. So your homework for next week is to find the verse Manda Sumanda Matayo Manda Bhagya Hyubhadrata. It's in the first canto, and it's in the first chapter of the first canto. So you find this verse and explain what it means. And secondly, you will, one second. Yeah, find the verse, Yad Yada Charati Shreshtas Tat Tat Evitaro Kuru Sapramanam Kurute Lokastad Anuvartate. It's in the 7th chapter, 3rd verse. And explain what that verse means. And show, and then, so those 2 verses, the one in the first canto, first chapter, that explains the deterioration of human society, and then the 7th chapter, 3rd verse, which explains how people will follow the example of a pious king or an impious ruler, and explain, give an example of how unqualified governmental officials like presidents or kings have misled the people in the past and created this Manda Sumanda Matayo Manda Bhagya Upadrata, this deterioration of society. And then compare that to pious leaders like Yudhisthira or Prahlad Maharaj or Lord Ramachandra, who upheld the principles of Dharma and made society not only prosperous, and happy, but spiritually surcharged so that the people go back to Godhead rather than take birth again and go to hell. Okay, so that's your homework for next week. Are there any questions? No questions?
I see none.
Okay. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Thank you very much. And